My name is Dr. Jamie Garner, and I'm the Associate Director of the Augusta University Center for Writing Excellence. Welcome to Crafting Your 3-Minute Thesis Slide for Impact, a webinar brought to you by the AU Center for Writing Excellence. For this presentation, we're excited to partner with the Graduate School and the Augusta University 3-Minute Thesis Competition. Many 3-minute thesis participants find the slide to be one of the most difficult parts of the presentation for a lot of reasons. Maybe you're not the artsy type and the creative part gets away from you. Maybe your research is really complex and boiling it down to a single slide gives you some trouble. In today's webinar, we're going to offer insight from the Center for Writing Excellence about how to make an impact with your 3MT slide. That is, we'll think about some things that make for an effective 3MT slide, we'll offer some do's and don'ts, and we'll give you a sense of some of the references that we've used and resources available to you to assist you with crafting your own 3-minute thesis slide. We're going to cover a lot of ground today as we discuss how to design your 3-minute thesis slide in a way that enhances your presentation rather than distracts or detracts from it. So first, I want to start with a roadmap to show you where we're headed. We'll begin by talking about some of the rules and criteria, both unofficial and official. Then we'll move on to thinking a little bit about the purpose for the 3MT slide and its relationship to the audience. Next, the meat of the presentation is going to be talking about some ways to craft your 3MT slide, some things to think about as you're working on it. We'll boil all that down with some do's and don'ts, and then we'll look at a couple of example slides. We'll talk about some next steps, resources, and references finally available to you from the Center for Writing Excellence. So first, don't underestimate the slide. The purpose of today's presentation is to give aspiring 3-minute thesis competitors guidance about how to craft a winning slide. We chose that word craft intentionally because the slide is something to which care should be given. You can go online and find reports from 3MT judges across the globe who say that one thing that frustrates them is when the slide appears to have been slapped together at the last second and that little care was devoted to it, or it seems unrelated to the research, and even when the delivery and content of the presentation were excellent. When it's time to deliver your 3MT presentation, you want to be confident that your slide is effectively conceived, attractively designed, and closely related to the presentation. So, to kick off today's webinar, first and foremost, don't underestimate the importance of the 3MT slide. Give yourself ample time to think about it. As you begin working on the presentation, start thinking about the slide from the very moment you begin. The slide is an opportunity to help your presentation stick in the minds of your audience, and a well-designed slide can make all the difference, especially if your content is highly complex. In addition to giving yourself ample time, make sure that you try out several iterations of the slide well in advance. Get feedback on those iterations and ask your audience or whoever's watching it which slide resonated most with them. On screen, you'll see the rules of the 3-minute thesis slide from the founders of 3MT at the University of Queensland. You get to use a single static PowerPoint slide with no transitions or animations. The slide will be present during the entire oration. There can also be no video, and you can't use any props. Also, not mentioned in the rules, but don't plagiarize your slide or use any content without giving credit to the author. Any designs that you use should be your own, or you should at least give, and maybe in the form of a citation, some kind of credit to the author somewhere on the slide. Don't present work that's not yours as if it is yours or as if you created it. The criteria for the slide portion of your 3MT presentation can be found under the engagement and communication portion of the rubric. There are 3 parts to the criteria here. First, that the oration was delivered clearly and the language was appropriate for a non-specialist audience. Second, that the PowerPoint is well-defined and enhanced the presentation. Finally, that the presenter conveyed enthusiasm for the research and captured and maintained the audience's attention. Let's leave the first and third points aside for now, though, and talk about point 2. What does it mean to be well-defined and that it enhanced the presentation? After reviewing countless winning 3MT slides, the Center for Writing Excellence has a few suggestions about what these might mean. Winning 3MT slides that we've looked at are well-defined in a few senses. First, that the audience will be able to understand immediately with little guessing what the PowerPoint slide is, what they're actually looking at. Second, Fairly quickly into the presentation, your audience will see how the slide relates to the presentation, how it's relevant to the kind of key point that you want to convey. Next, the slide should also be well defined in the sense that it's visually appealing and designed in a high resolution format. Next, what does it mean to enhance the presentation? The slide should help to kind of set a mood or tone, reinforcing the key idea or multiple key ideas of your presentation. The slide should not distract the viewer from the presentation by including too much text or images that are low quality or anything else. So those are the rules for the 3-minute thesis slide, straight from the founding body for 3-minute thesis. Next, let's talk a little bit about purpose and audience. There are 3 key purposes to the 3-minute thesis slide, which you can see on the screen here. First, the slide helps you communicate a key idea from your research visually. Next, it helps to enhance your explanation, clarifying your ideas for your audience with the visual appeal. Finally, it can help your presentation stick with your audience and make it memorable. On the screen, we've included the judging and criteria panel page from the 3MT founders. The audience for the 3MT presentation is going to be experts in a variety of fields who may or may not be conversant in your field. Judges will, however, want you to be able to explain your research to a non-specialist audience. So based on this criteria, 3 to 5 judges, balance of judges based on age, gender, academic or professional positions. Hopefully there's a marketing or communications member. You can't know exactly who the judges are, but we can suss out a few things from this list. They are likely to be very educated, professionals and professors, professional staff in your field. They're not likely, just based on sheer probability, to be an expert in your field. And then an extra point that I want to hammer home is that they are not inside your head. This may seem obvious, but I think it's important to understand. To this last point about context and the fact that your audience is not inside your head, let me pause a moment. You're going to be presenting to a group of judges who all come from different contexts and likely very different contexts than you. You want the slide to be as relatable as possible to as wide an audience as possible. So let's say you're doing your 3MT presentation about your research on the dangers of AI-assisted tools in policing, and you opt to go with a picture of the Daleks, the terrifying robot villains from the BBC series Doctor Who. Even if Doctor Who is somewhat popular, there's a good chance that your audience isn't going to get your reference. You could end up completely undermining your credibility, and you'll leave your audience confused, even if the picture is tangentially related to your topic. So remember, your task when designing your 3MT slide is to present to an audience who is smart, but they're from different backgrounds than you, and they're not inside your head. Your job is to make sure that the audience understands the relationship between your presentation and the on-screen slide. So what are some ways that you can do that? Next, we'll get into the meat of the presentation. Some of the major steps that you can take and things you can think about to make your 3MT slide as appealing as possible. Again, we can't cover every aspect of this, but there are a few key things that we've observed that winning slides tend to do. You can make it visually appealing, keep it simple, decide whether you want to go with a more literal slide, a more conceptual slide, or some balance of the two. Don't be afraid to get a little emotional, but not too emotional. And when you get to the presentation itself, don't make your audience guess what your slide means. Within the criteria for a well-defined slide is the promise that your slide will be aesthetically appealing. This step's a little outside my area of expertise, but I did want to share with you a few key points that we've gleaned about aesthetic appeal from reviewing several 3MT slides. There isn't time enough to go over every aspect of the technical dimensions of crafting your 3MT slide, and I'm not the right person to tell you how to use Adobe Photoshop to make your image high resolution. If you're interested in those kinds of questions, check out Kelsey Schaefer's presentation, Designing Excellent 3MT Slides, available from Clemson University. We're sharing it on the resources and references slide at the end of this presentation. So, even though we're not going to get into some of those kinds of technical details, there are a few general things to keep in mind. You should avoid overcrowding your slide with too much information. You should make sure the text is visible and concise with only one font and one font size. You should try to leave some negative space, some white space, if possible. Thinking about the details of your visual appeal also matters to accessibility and who is going to be able to actually appreciate your image. The 3MT slide should be visually and aesthetically appealing, but it should also take stock of things like color contrast. You can ensure accessibility by using colors with high contrast for background and text, and use a resource such as contrastratio.com to test the contrast between your background and your text. So keeping it simple. This is a Facebook post by the 3-Minute Thesis staff at Queensland, and I wanted to pause over it for a moment to talk about the importance of keeping the slide simple. This post, it just asks, well, how do you fit your whole dissertation thesis into one PowerPoint slide? And the answer is that you don't. You pick one key concept or one key idea to convey to the audience. And similarly, the slide is kind of the same way. You've spent so much time on your research, and there's a temptation to cram as much information as possible into the slide, but this thinking won't help you get first place. Instead, what you want to do is use the slide as a way to illustrate something about the key point of your presentation. And you can do this by keeping your slide relatively simple, showing one key idea or concept that you then kind of illuminate and explain in your presentation. Let's take a look at the example that 3MT gave of what a good, effective slide looks like. Very simple, right? We don't know what this presentation was about, probably something maybe from behavioral psychology, maybe something about some kind of cognitive dissonance. But it's a memorable, evocative image. The only text on the image is an artist's signature. I'll show some other examples of winning 3MT slides in a moment, which seem maybe to break some of these rules here and there, but the key takeaway is that by keeping it simple, your audience will, one, be more likely to remember your image, especially if it's something striking, and two, you won't overwhelm the content of your presentation by providing too much text. Here's a slide also, just for contrast, that the tweet mentioned as a particularly bad slide. They were very kind. They didn't pick on anyone who's actually presented to the 3-Minute Thesis, but they came up with this kind of greatest hits of mistakes that you can make in your 3-Minute Thesis slide. Not only too much text, but text with lots of different fonts. Much of it unreadable, just unreadable in the sense that it just becomes an eyesore with so much going on on one page. We have multiple types of images. We've got pictures, we've got charts, we have the 3MT logo, and there's just a whole lot going on here that goes wrong with this very, very ugly sample slide. I think this is a very hyperbolic example, but 3-Minute Thesis's point is well taken. This kind of shows you lots of different things to avoid from, if you use text, be consistent with your text. Only include one key image. Don't try to cram everything about your project onto the slide. Instead, you want to pick some key or kind of controlling idea that your presentation is going to eliminate. So simplicity is going to help your message stick, but you still want to say something with your slide. And this leads us into one of the great points of tension that every 3MT participant has to navigate. And that's whether to go for a literal slide or a highly conceptual one. Let me explain what I mean by those. A literal slide depicts a key aspect of your research using a single image, chart, or graph without the aid of some sort of metaphor or symbolism. This very clean, highly readable slide, which was the slide that Yasmin Nouri, the winner of 3MT at the University of Otago in New Zealand, presented in 2022, shows just an example of this. This is a much more literal slide. The title of her presentation was The Nature of the Beast, and her presentation discussed her research trying to understand the mechanisms that enable CAR T-cell therapy, a process that uses genetic modification to destroy cancer cells. I apologize if I butcher any science. As I was reviewing these, this is not my field. I'm a writing guy. But so throughout the speech, she uses several kind of controlling metaphors, such as like fighting a war, and she talks about this idea of the nature of the beast. But her slide is very simple and shows viewers this very straightforward chart demonstrating how the process of CAR T-cell therapy works and kind of what's happening with it as genetic modification occurs. with the cells. The big benefit to going literal is that you can really simplify your research and show it to your audience in a way that they will understand. It might not have the wow factor that a really stunning single image might, but they will understand your content, and there is something to be said for that. So a literal one really enables you to convey explicitly kind of what's going on in your presentation or with your research in a way that they'll really get that idea. On the other end of the spectrum, if going literal is one end, then the other end is going highly conceptual. So, and that's kind of what the slide the slide depicted on the previous page was highly literal, and it was basically a chart that showed you a key process in a research. So swinging to the opposite end, you could go really conceptual, as this presentation by Purdue University's 2020 3MT competitor Juliana Hay did. Her dissertation in the field of engineering education examined the factors that led to especially high burnout and withdrawal rates among undergrads in engineering to understand kind of what it means to thrive in the field of engineering. Her ultimate purpose with the research is kind of thinking about ways to increase engineering retention rates so that they go on to lead healthier, fulfilling careers in engineering. And this really eye-catching, really funny image shows a happy kind of scholarly owl fresh out of high school maybe on the left, and then by the end of the engineering students college career, they are completely frazzled, desperately clutching a cup of coffee, and it's very memorable and colorful and interesting. It doesn't have much in the way of text. We just get engineering student life, first semester, last semester, and then there's a citation down there to the artwork. And it doesn't tell you everything that the speaker does with her research, but what she does that works really well is she gives this kind of evocative image, and then during the talk she refers to the image to explain kind of the consequences of engineering education for students if it doesn't address the field's kind of high rates of burnout. A problem that 3MT presenters can run into with their slide is kind of this desire to wow the audience with a slide that's overly conceptual, and you kind of have to think carefully about that. The benefit of going really conceptual is that it can be incredibly striking, but it's going to be up to you during the presentation to make it clear to the reader how your more conceptual slide connects to the presentation. If you're worried about boring your audience by being too literal, describing one of your processes, or just giving them a graph or a chart, or being too conceptual, many winning slides find a way to strike a balance between the two. This slide by the 2015 winner at University of New South Wales, Susan Ireland, presented on ways that artificial sweeteners affect people on the molecular level. Her slide is whimsical and fun and colorful. She connects it to her talk by suggesting this analogy between taste receptors' insatiable craving for sweet things and then a toddler who loves candy. It clearly conveys the process of what's happening, that's the literal level, with a playful and memorable kind of metaphorical image, the toddler as the taste receptor. In addition to striking a balance between the literal and conceptual, winning 3MT slides aren't afraid to incorporate some emotion. Remember, you're presenting to actual human beings, and there are a range of emotions available to you. Happiness, nostalgia, sorrow, fear, anger, these are all at play here. In my own field of rhetoric and writing, we talk a lot about the pathos appeal, the appeal to emotion, and this is a powerful one. It's one of the more powerful. You can see a good example of this in leaning a little bit toward conceptual, but by Peyman Yousefi, and this was the People's Choice Award winner for 3MT at Purdue University's 2022 competition. So let me explain what's going on here so you can get a sense of how emotion works in this one. His thesis was entitled, "It Will Never Happen Again, The Myth of Disaster Immunity." In his dissertation, he studies the social conditions that lead to a lack of awareness and a false sense of security with respect to recurrent natural disasters over time, particularly when natural disasters strike in the same place over periods of 40, 50 years apart. In his talk, Yousefi uses this clean, angular, very striking design to show this timeline of major natural disasters. And this one really capitalizes on kind of using the audience's emotions, showing 3 disasters occurring roughly 40 years apart, and then kind of leaving the question open of what's going to happen next. He connects his talk with the images by opening with a quotation from the governor of Louisiana after Hurricane Betsy hit, saying, "It will never happen again," but erasing that will never and writing in bright red font to change the sentiment to it can happen again. It's a very chilling way to get into the kind of purpose of his dissertation, and I think it works really nicely to get the audience thinking about these tragedies that have happened in the past and kind of the hubris of saying it will never happen again. So it's a very striking one. But of course, you want to be careful with emotions. You don't want to stray kind of into the realm of being corny or cheesy. I mean, what does it mean to be corny? This is kind of in the eye of the beholder, and it's going to depend on your judges. But I can tell you generally, with insight from my own field, what makes an effective emotional appeal is that it shouldn't feel manipulative. It should feel in proportion to the kind of topic. It's going to feel truthful and relevant to the research on display. What keeps this one from being, overly exploitative, it's dealing with a serious issue, and the image kind of takes the issue seriously by highlighting the damage done, and that's the thing that he really wants to address in his dissertation. The stakes of the pictures that he presents here match up with the stakes that he's trying to address in his dissertation. Now, whatever you do, whether you go emotional, whether you go literal, whether you go conceptual, don't make your audience guess or wonder what the image has to do with your presentation. This is one of the big mistakes, one of the things that really gets people in trouble with the 3-minute thesis competition. You put a slide that is perhaps too conceptual, maybe you get it inside your head, what the slide means and how it relates to your talk, but you never make any reference to it during your presentation. You're just hoping that the audience is going to get it. And there are lots and lots of ways around this. Very successful 3-minute thesis presenters do a lot of different things to help the audience understand the relationship between the presentation and the slide and kind of create coherence, to create synergy between the two. There's a few ways you can do this. Just quickly saying something along the lines of, as the image on screen shows, and then connecting that to your talk, just referencing the slide quickly can help your audience understand kind of what's going on. Second, you could just use the on-screen image as kind of a launching point for the story your presentation tells. In the last example we looked at, Yousefi took that slide and used it to kind of kick off his story and then get into his research, which was kind of spurred by it and related to it. Finally, you can also, talk about the images on screen without necessarily referencing the slide. The slide on artificial sweeteners did this really nicely by, just talking about by explaining this analogy between how the taste receptors are like a toddler who craves sweets, and suddenly the whole image that's on screen really snaps into place and really brings that presentation to life. Whatever you do, whether you directly reference the image or just use it as a launching point for your story or talk about the images on screen without referencing the slide, connect the image with your content early in your talk. In the many, many samples that we reviewed while putting together this presentation, it was clear within the first 15 or 20 seconds what the slide had to do with the presentation, whether the person referenced it explicitly or whether they talked about the images on screen without necessarily referencing the slide. It was clear to the audience what the slide had to do with the presentation. So above all, whatever you do, don't make your audience guess. You do not want your audience to wonder what the slide has to do with the presentation. So let's sum up some of the things that we've talked about during this presentation. First, the don'ts. Don't overcrowd your slide. Don't include lots of, if any, text. Don't include lots of pictures. Don't include images that are maybe irrelevant or not closely conceptually tied to your topic. And don't provide images that only experts in your field will understand. Remember that question of context that we talked about earlier. And as well, don't plagiarize. Next, the do's. Use high-resolution, high-quality images with high contrast between text and background color for accessibility. Do keep it simple and only include a little text, if any.
Think carefully also about whether to go for a literal or conceptual slide or whether to balance the two. And use images and ideas that will make sense to as broad an audience as possible.
So let's take a look at some examples. Here's a slide by the winner of the 2021 3MT competition at Yale, Matthew Ellis. I've put a link to the presentation below, and it's available in our references page as well. His presentation was entitled Using Stem Cells to Model and Treat Cardiovascular Disease. His presentation, or the slide anyway, skews a little bit more toward the literal than the conceptual, but what he does that's really clever is he makes use of emojis to explain his research on how he uses the process of induced pluripotency. Again, I apologize if I get any science wrong here, to study the currently incurable problem of supravalvular aortic stenosis. His use of these colorful emojis no doubt helped the presentation stick in the minds of his audience, but we should also appreciate the more subtle benefit of using emojis. It's reasonably safe to assume that everyone in the audience knows what they are and understands what they mean as a kind of textless shorthand to convey information. Remember earlier when I said that the audience isn't inside your head? This is a great way to get around that problem. Find a novel use for some incredibly common image like an emoji that the audience is going to immediately understand. Ellis uses this to his advantage to create this kind of synergy between the processes that he's talking about and the images on screen to really convey what his research is about in a clear and effective way. Let's take a look at another example. This is by Katarina Dowdy at the University of Western Australia in 2019. The topic of her project was reducing global waste through insect farming. She talks about how global food waste is this massive problem, and she proposes a novel solution to address it by farming black soldier flies. She describes black soldier flies as this kind of key link in a closed food production loop. The bugs are very good at digesting organic material, so all the massive amounts of food that we throw away, they could be digested. And what she finds is that the calorie content of these bugs after they've digested this organic material is very similar to the fish meal that's used to feed farmed fish. So what she ends up proposing is that once the bugs are harvested, they could be incorporated into the fish farming industry pretty easily. And rather than using fish meal, the bugs would be used as a replacement in the diets for rainbow trout. And what she ends up doing that I think works really nicely is on a literal level, she kind of zooms in on these key concepts that she talks about in her talk. She shows this, food waste is equivalent to 1.5 Australias. She shows us the black soldier fly, the beautifully plated trout, and then the images of rainbow trout also swimming in the sea highlight these concepts. But what's cool is if you move clockwise, she also subtly traces the food loop in her image. We create this waste equivalent to 1.5 Australias. So we farm the black soldier flies to deal with the waste. We feed these flies who eat the organic material to the trout, and then we eat the trout and create more waste, and the cycle continues. This is a really elegant and sophisticated slide that, even though it does break that rule about only having one image on the screen, it really sets up this nice kind of cluster to show you the story that she's trying to convey here. And it ends up working really nicely and to her advantage. So you have a draft of your 3-minute thesis slide. What do you do next? Well, you should come to the Center for Writing Excellence and make an appointment with us to work on your 3-minute thesis presentation. By scanning this QR code, you'll be taken to our website where you can make an appointment, and one of our highly qualified writing consultants will work with you for 45 minutes, both online or in person, whatever kind of mode you prefer to work in, to help you figure out how to make your 3MT slide and presentation the best that it can be. Stay tuned also. We will be announcing some 3-minute thesis practice sessions to give you a chance to practice both your slide and presentation at the same time. We'll have more details on those to come, so stay tuned for that. Next, I just want to point out our references. Everything that we've referenced throughout this presentation is available here. I just want to show you that we also put links to all of the presentations that we reference throughout this video. And there's also some really great guides here for designing your 3-minute thesis slide that we pulled from. So please check this out, and this is the kind of thing that every year that we do this, we'll hopefully add more and more to this list.
If you have any questions about the Augusta University Center for Writing Excellence, there are several ways that you can get in touch with us. Check out our website at augusta.edu/CWE for more information about the many, many services that we provide. Make sure to make an appointment with one of our writing consultants too. If you'd like to talk to a human being, you can call us at 706-737-1402 at our Somerville location at Allgood Hall. Finally, you can always email us at cwe@augusta.edu. We look forward to hearing from you soon, and good luck with the 3-minute thesis competition.